The Glory of Bon Bibi. Kusum was from the nearby island of Segilia. Her father died while foraging for firewood in a place that was off limits to villagers. He had not been in possession of a permit at the time, so Kusum's mother had received no compensation. With no means of livelihood, she was reduced to a state of such destitution that she considered herself fortunate when a man from their village, a landowner by the name of Dilip Chowdhury, had offered to find her a job in the city. Knowing that he had found employment for other women, Kusum's mother could see no reason why she should not accept Dilip's offer. Leaving Kusum with relatives, she had gone off with him to take the train into Calcutta. Returning alone, Dilip had told Kusum that her mother was doing housework for a good family and would send for her shortly. That time came soon enough. A month or so later, Dilip came to see Kusum and told her that her mother had sent word asking him to bring Kusum to Calcutta. It was at this stage that Horen Naskor had got to know of Dilip's plan. Horen had worked with Kusum's father, and he also happened to be distantly related to Kusum through his wife. He had sought her out and warned her that Dilip was linked to a gang that trafficked in women. What kind of job could this procurer have found for Kusum's mother? She was probably trapped in a brothel somewhere in Sonangachi. As for Kusum, she was of much greater value to Dilip than her mother had been. Young girls like her were known to fetch large sums of money. If Dilip had his way, she would end up in either Calcutta's red light district or worse, in some brothel in Bombay. Instead, Horan had brought Kusum to Lucy Bari and put her in the custody of the Women's Union. Pending some more permanent arrangement, all the union's members would look after her. During the months she had spent in Lucy Bari, Kusum had got to know the island well, and she became Kanai's guide and mentor. She told him about its people and their children and about everything happening around it, cockfights and pujas, births and deaths. Kanai, for his part, would tell her about his school, his friends, and the ways of the city. Although to him these stories seemed pale in comparison with hers, she would listen with rapt attention, breaking in from time to time to ask questions. "Do you think I can come to the city with you?" she asked once. "I like to see where you live." This silenced Kanai. It amazed him that Kusum should even ask such a question. Did she have no idea at all how things had worked? He tried to think of taking her home to Calcutta and cringed to imagine the tone of voice in which his mother would speak to her and the questions the neighbors would ask. "Is that your new Jai? But don't you already have any other maid servant coming to do the washing and sweeping? Why do you need this one?" "You wouldn't like Calcutta," Kanai said at length. "You wouldn't feel at home." It was from Kusum that Kanai learned that a troupe of traveling actors was soon to come to Lucy Bari to stage performances of The Glory of Bon Bibi. He had heard mention of this story a couple of times on the island, but was unsure about its particulars. When he asked Kusum about it, she gasped as if in shock. "You mean you don't know the story of Bon Bibi?" "No." "Then whom do you call on when you're afraid?" Unable to entangle the implications of this, Kanai changed the subject, but the question nagged at his mind, and later in the day he asked Nirmal about the story of Bon Bibi. Nirmal waved him airily away. "It's just a tale they tell around here. Don't bother yourself with it. It's just false consciousness. That's all it is." "But tell me about it." "Horan is the one you should ask," said Nirmal. "If you did, he would tell you that Bon Bibi rules over the jungle, that the tigers, crocodiles, and other animals do her bidding. Haven't you noticed the little shrines outside the houses here? The statues are of Bon Bibi. You would think that in a place like this, people would pay close attention to the true wonders of the reality around them. But no, they prefer the imaginary miracles of gods and saints. But tell me the story, said Kanai. Who is it about? What happens? It's all the usual stuff. Nirmal threw up his hands in impatience. Gods, saints, animals, demons. It's too long for me to tell. Better you find out for yourself. Go to the performance. The stage for the Glory of Bon Bibi was erected on the open expanse of Lucy Barry's Maiden, between the compound of the Hamilton house and the school. Its design was so simple that it took less than a day to set up. The floor, a few planks of wood, was laid on a trestle and enclosed with an open scaffolding of bamboo poles. During performances, sheets of painted cloth were suspended from the poles at the rear. These served as backdrops for the audience and screens for the actors so that they could eat, smoke, and change costumes out of public view. Several large hissing gas lamps illuminated the spectacle, and music was provided by a battery operated cassette recorder and loudspeakers. As a rule, night came early to Lucy Barry. Candles and lamps were expensive and used as sparingly as possible. People ate their evening meal in the glow of twilight, and by the time darkness fell, the island had usually fallen silent except for a few animal sounds that carried across the water. For this reason, a nighttime diversion was a major occasion, the anticipation of which provided at least as much pleasure as the event itself. Great numbers of people, Kanai and Kusum among them, stayed up night after night to attend the performances. For Kanai, the greatest surprise came right at the start of the show. This was because the story of the tiger goddess did not begin either in the heavens or on the banks of the Ganges, like the mythological tales with which he was familiar. Instead, the opening scene was set in a city in Arabia, and the backdrop was painted with mosques and minarets. The setting was Medina, one of the holiest places in Islam. Here lived a man called Ibrahim, a childless but pious Muslim who led the austere life of a Sufi faqir. Through the intervention of the archangel Jibril, Ibrahim became the father of blessed twins, Bon Bibi and Shah Jongoli. When the twins came of age, the archangel brought them word that they had been chosen for a divine mission. They were to travel from Arabia to the country of 18 tides, Atero Batir Desh, in order to make it fit for human habitation. Thus charged, Bon Bibi and Shah Jangoli set off from the mangrove forest of Bengal, dressed in the simple robes of Sufi mendicants. The jungles of the country of 18 tides were then the realm of Dokin Rai, a powerful demon king who held sway over every being that lived there, every animal as well as every ghoul, ghost, and malevolent spirit. Towards mankind he harbored a hatred coupled with insatiable desires. For the pleasures afforded by human flesh he had a craving that knew no limit. One day, Dokin Rai heard strange new voices in the jungle calling out the azan, the Muslim call to prayer. This was his voice. This was his notice that Bon Bibi and Shah Jongoli had come into his realm. Rousing his hordes, the incest demon set upon the trespassers only to be put to rout in a pitched battle. But Bon Bibi was merciful in victory, and she decided that one half of the Tide country would remain a wilderness. This part of the forest she left to Dokin Rai and his demon hordes. The rest she claimed for herself, and under her rule this once forested domain was soon made safe for human settlement. Thus, order was brought to the land of 18 tides, with its two halves, the wild and the sown, being held in careful balance. All was well until human greed intruded to upset this order. On the edges of the tide country lived a man called Dona, who had put together a fleet of 7 ships in the hope of making a fortune in the jungle. Dona's fleet was about to set sail when it was discovered that the crew was exactly 1 man short of a full complement. The only person at hand was a young lad called Duki, Sorrow, a name nothing if not apt, for this boy had long been cursed with misfortune. He had lost his father as a child and now lived in abject poverty with his old and ailing mother. It was with the greatest reluctance that the old woman allowed her son to go, and at the time of leave taking, she gave him a last word of advice. Were he ever to find himself in trouble, he was to call on Bon Bibi. She was the savior of the weak and a mother of mercy to the poor. She was sure to come to his aid. The expedition set off and wound its way down the rivers of the tide country until at last it came to an island by the name of Kedokali Char. It so happened that this island fell within Dokin Rai's territory, and unknown to the sailors, the Demon King had already prepared a surprise for them. When they went into the forest, strange things began to happen. They were given tantalizing glimpses of plum hives hanging from branches, but when they approached, the hives seemed to disappear only to reappear again at a distance. They could not avail themselves of even one, and Dona was reduced to despair. But that night Dokin Rai revealed himself to Dona in a dream and proposed a pact in which they would each provide for the satisfaction of the other's desires. The demon wanted the boy that Dona had brought on to his boat. It was an age since he had been able to sate his appetite for human beings, and he was now riven with a longing for the taste of Duki's flesh. In exchange, he would give Dona wealth beyond imagining, as much as could be carried on the boats. Overcome by greed, Dona assented to the bargain, and at once the creatures of the forest, the demons and ghosts, even the bees themselves began to load Dona's boats with a great cargo of honey and wax. Soon the vessels were full and could carry no more, and then it was time for Dona to keep his part of the bargain. Summoning Duki, he told him to go ashore to fetch some firewood. The boy had no recourse but to obey, and on his return found his worst misgivings confirmed. The ships were gone. And then, standing alone on the bank, trapped between river and forest, his eye caught a shimmer of black and gold. He was being stalked by a tiger, hidden in the greenery on the far shore. The animal was none other than Dokin Rai in disguise, and the demon shook the earth with a roar as he started his charge. At the sight of that immense body and those vast jowls flapping in the wind like sails, mortal terror seized Duki's soul. Even as he was losing consciousness, he recalled his mother's parting words and called out, "O Mother of Mercy, Bon Bibi, save me! Come to my side!" Bon Bibi was far away, but she crossed the waters in an instant. She revived the boy, taking him into her lap while her brother, Shah Jangoli, dealt a terrible chastisement to the demon. Then, transporting Duki to her home, she nursed him back to health. When it was time for him to return, she sent him back to his mother with a treasure trove of honey and wax. Thus did Bon Bibi show the world the law of the forest, which was that the rich and greedy would be punished while the poor and righteous were rewarded. Kenai had expected to be bored by this rustic entertainment, In Calcutta, he was accustomed to going to theaters like the Academy of Fine Arts and cinemas like the Globe, but much to his surprise, he was utterly absorbed. The terror he had felt when the demon charged Dookie was real and immediate. Although there was nothing convincing about the tiger, and it could be plainly seen that the animal was only a man dressed in a painted sheet and a mask. No less real were the tears of joy and gratitude that flowed from his eyes when Bon Bibi appeared at Dookie's side. Nor was he the only one. Everyone in the audience wept, although the actress's arrival was anything but instantaneous. On the contrary, the audience had actually had to hurry her along a little because even as Dookie lay unconscious with the tiger poised to devour him, she had stopped to lean over the side of the stage in order to clear her mouth of a great wad of pan. But the flow of the story was such that none of this seemed to matter, and well before the performance had ended, Kanai knew he wanted to see it again. The last performance of the Glory of Bon Bibi was something of special event, and many people came in from other islands. The crowd was much rowdier than on other days, and Kanai kept to the maiden's fringes, watching from a distance. By this time he knew the first part of this show well enough to be bored by it. At a certain point he dozed off and found on waking that he was sitting next to Kusum. "What's happening?" he whispered. "Where have they got to?" There was no answer. She was so enraptured by the performance that she seemed oblivious to his presence. Her absorption prompted him to glance at the stage, and he saw that he had slept longer than he had thought. The action was well advanced now. Dona and his fleet had arrived at Kadakali Char and would soon make his pact with the devil. "Kusum!" whispered Kanai, and when she turned briefly to look at him, he saw in the reflected glow of the gas lamps that she was biting her lip and her face was streaked with tears. Having seen for himself the emotions the story could evoke, he was not particularly surprised to see she was crying. But then, when she suddenly leaned over to bury her face in her knees, he knew there was more at issue here than could be accounted for by the performance alone. On an impulse, thinking to console her, he slid his hand along the ground, hoping to find her fingers. But her hand was not where he had expected it to be, and instead he found his fist entangled in the folds of her frock. His fingers grew frantic as he tried to extricate them, and instead of finding their way out, they encountered a soft and unexpectedly warm part of her body. The shock sparked by this contact passed through both of them like a bolt of electricity. Suppressing a cry, she jumped to her feet and went stumbling into the darkness. He would have run after her right then, but some furtive instinct of prudence prompted him to think of how this might look to watching eyes. He waited a minute or two and then pretended to head in the other direction. Circling back in the shadows, he caught up with her as she was nearing the compound of the Hamilton house. "Kusum! Wait! Stop!" There was just enough light from the now distant gas lamps for him to see. She was stumbling ahead, turning from time to time to wipe her dripping nose on her shoulder. "Kusum!" he cried, keeping his voice low. "Stop!" He had caught up with her now, and he gave her elbow a tug. "It was a mistake." She came to a halt, and he steeled himself for a flood of reproach. But she said nothing, and when he looked into her eyes, he knew that his link with her perturbation was only incidental, and that her grief sprang from a much deeper source than could be plumbed by a boy's mistaken touch. They were now very close to the gate of Hamilton House compound. On an impulse, Kanai vaulted over the gate and gestured to Kusum. Come on, come on. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, and he took her hand and went racing up the mossy flagstones that flanked the pond. They came to the steps that led up to the house, and Kanai led Kusum up to the shaded veranda. They seated themselves on the floor with their backs to the old wooden walls. From this position they had a clear view of the maiden, and they could even see Duki lying prone on the stage, beseeching Bon Bibi to save him. It was Kusum who spoke first. I called her too, she said, but she never came. Who? Bon Bibi. The day my father died, I saw it all. It happened in front of me, and I called her again and again. It was an ordinary day, no different from any other, and it happened under the full light of a blazing noonday sun. There was money in the house and food as well, because her father had come back just the day before from a long and successful fishing trip. The one untoward thing he had to report was that he had lost his gamcha. He had wanted to eat well, so her mother had made rice, dal, and vegetables, but when it came time to cook some fish, the firewood had run out. On being told of this, he had flown into a rage. It was many days since he had a good meal, and he was not going to be deprived of one now. He stormed out of the house, saying he would be back soon with more firewood. Their hut was in the lee of the embankment, on the shore of a narrow creek. It took just 10 or 15 minutes of rowing to get to the forest on the far bank. Although this was a reserve, it was common for people of their village to forage for firewood there. Kusum followed him out of the house and stood on the embankment as he rowed across the river. This took longer than usual because there was a strong wind blowing in from the far shore. He was pushing the boat up the bank when she saw it, not the whole animal, but enough of its flashing black and gold coat to know it was there. Do you mean, Kanai interrupted, that you saw? But even before he could say the word bag, tiger, she had slammed a hand over his mouth. No, you can't use the word. To say it is to summon it. The animal was in the trees that lined the shore, and from the direction of its advance she knew it had watched the boat as it came across the river. At Kusum's first scream, her mother and many others from the hamlet ran up to the embankment. But her father, for whom the shout of warning had been intended, didn't hear her, for the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. Within moments, dozens of people had joined her on the embankment, and they all saw what she had seen. The animal was stalking her father. The men of the village raced to get their boats into the water, while the women shouted and banged on pots and pans, making as much noise as they could. But it made no difference, for the wind was against them. The sound did not carry to the man on the far bank. The animal, too, was upwind of its prey, and they could see its coat flashing as it closed in. Because of the distinctiveness of its own odor, it was skilled in dealing with the wind, and it knew that the people on the other bank were powerless against these gusts. So great was its confidence that in the last stretch it actually broke cover and went racing along the shore in full view of the far shore, intent on its prey. It no longer cared about concealment. This was in itself an astonishing sight, almost without precedent, for the great cats of the Tide country were like ghosts, never revealing their presence except through marks, sounds, and smells. They were so rarely seen that to behold one, it was said, was to be as good as dead, and indeed the sight caused several of the women on the embankment to lose consciousness. But as for Kusum, she sank to her knees and began to whisper, "Help! O Mother of Mercy! O Bon Bibi, save my father!" She had shut her eyes so she didn't see the end, but she heard everything. Because of the wind's direction, the sounds that accompanied the kill carried across the water with exceptional clarity. Kusum heard the roar that froze her father. She heard his cry for help. "Pachao!" She heard the sound of his bones cracking as the animal swiped a paw across his neck. She heard the rustle of the mangrove as the animal dragged the corpse into the forest. And all through this, she never once stopped reciting Bon Bibi's name. It was Horan who lifted her from the dust. "Bon Bibi's heard you," he told her. "Sometimes this is the means she chooses to call those who are closest to her. Men like your father, bullies, they are like the first to go." Kusum's body had crumpled as she was telling this story, leaving her slumped against Kanai's shoulder, and he could feel her hair on his skin. Her story had caused an upwelling of emotion in him that constricted his throat. He wanted to fold her in his arms, to ward off her grief. He wanted to wipe away her tears. He wanted his body to become a buffer between her and the world. This was the most intense physical sensation he had ever experienced. This need to protect, to defend, to make a bodily expression of his sympathy. He brushed her eyes with his lips, and the softness and warmth was such that he could not stop. He put an arm around her and pulled her towards him, pressing his head against hers. Suddenly they heard the sound of running feet, flying up the teak of stairs of Hamilton Bungalow. "Kusum! Kusum!" It was Horan's voice calling to her in a hoarse whisper. Kusum stood up. "Yes, I'm here." Horan appeared in front of them, panting. "Kusum," he said, "we have to go. I saw Dilip. He's here with some men looking for you. You're not safe here. You have to get away." Horan squatted beside Kanai and stuck a finger in his face. "And as for you, little Babu, if you tell anyone where she's gone or with whom, you won't be safe either. Do you understand?" Without waiting for any response from Kanai, he took hold of Kusum's hand and led her off at a run. This was Kanai's last glimpse of Kusum. The next day, Nirmal announced to him that his exile was over and he was to be taken back to Calcutta.